Hello, we are doing a special podcast with the now former Albuquerque Police Department Chief of Police, Mike Geier. The chief comes to us with over 40 years of police experience. He was an officer in Chicago, Albuquerque, and Rio Rancho, and was then recruited by Mayor Tim Keller to be the new chief of Albuquerque. Members from the Albuquerque Raw editorial board sat down with the retired chief to get his perspective on his career, fighting crime in Albuquerque, and how elected and appointed leaders are responding to the needs of the citizens of Albuquerque. We will first start with retired Chief Geier giving his brief career.
Well, thanks, Mark. I appreciate you guys having me here today. I started back in 1974. My dad was a police officer, so I'm second generation. At the time, we lived in the north suburban area of Chicago. In Chicago, you can test in the city and you can work in the suburbs. Suburbs were higher paying, and then you can work task force, like similar to what we have here, and then be part of those task force. Can work more of a lot of the suburbs group together, their regional SWAT teams and things like that. So there's a lot of opportunities. So I worked in north suburban Chicago, in an area called Wilmette, which was mixed because one suburb next to it was lower income, and the one on the other side was higher. So we were in an area that attracted crime for the fact that people could rip people off that had money, and also were the drugs coming in from the other side. So it was an interesting career. I made detective fairly early in my career. I had a very successful career there. I did many things. I was an instructor, evidence technician, got promoted to sergeant and back on patrol for a while, and then detective sergeant, and made lieutenant. And during my career, I was received a number of awards, a very high number of commendations. I was a hustler. They, kind of always on the move. 3 times I was officer of the year there. I loved police work. I, would have stayed there forever. I was on a list to be, at that time it was a commander position, which was like ours captains. And my wife's got scleroderma. It's a very serious disease. And right now it's involving her immune system and respiratory, so you can imagine with COVID what we're going through and did go through for the last 9 months or so here, or as long as this has been here. But so I was looking. They told us she had pneumonia 3 winters. The last one they said if she gets it again, their lungs are filling too fast. So they go to a drier, warmer climate. And so I searched a couple. Actually, I tried Florida, which is way too humid, but Arizona way too hot. Vegas, I was on a waiting list to take the written, but Albuquerque called first. So in January of 1994, I started testing with Albuquerque Police, and we recruited in the old main police station. I met Phil Carolyn and John Bodie and different people that worked there at the time, and I was recruited and originally was hoping to be a lateral. Going from a lieutenant to back to the officer's level was not a bad thing. I relished being on the street. I kind of, even though as a watch commander, I get tired of being behind the desk. So I got a call that they weren't going to do laterals anymore. And I was pretty embedded in the process, and I was already in the process of trying to, going to sell the home and uproot myself, my wife, and the 2 kids at the time. And 20 years in Illinois, you need 20 years to retire, but it's at a very low rate, it's 50%. And you can't collect until you're age 50. So my decision was, you're 41 years old, you're going to turn 41 now. Do I make the move? And so what I weighed the odds came to her health and the family and uprooting. And they said, well, you're in the next cadet class. So I went from being a lieutenant watch commander, making around $60,000, to being a cadet with a shaved head, getting yelled at by people half my age, and at $8 an hour. So it was a sacrifice, but we had saved up some vacation money and eventually sold the other house. But it was a challenge. But I'm not afraid. You humble yourself sometimes, and you learn more by paying your dues. And I didn't know the city well, and I didn't know the police department, and it was a great way what better way to spend 26, 28 weeks, whatever it was back then, to learn about, rather than on the seat of my pants, trying to go out there on my own. So that's when I ended up in Albuquerque, and I've been here. I was here 20 years, and the opportunity when the DOJ first came, Rio Rancho was hiring, and I kind of got a little bit recruited, so I put in for that, made it, and spent a little over 3.5 years there. I had some time off that I took, again, because we took custody of 2 grandkids that we inherited, and they were very young at the time, and so I helped at home. And I'd met Tim Keller before, and he had told me he was running for mayor, and gave me the opportunity. And before I knew it, I was back as a chief in December of 2017 in Albuquerque, the city that I really love and live in, and I care about.
I want to expand a little bit on the Chicago career, because I mean, obviously Chicago in the '70s was had to be a crazy place to start a career as a police officer. That experience you gained in Chicago, did it make Albuquerque seem like, you know, I can handle anything at this point, or is it or are there different challenges for the different city? I mean, walk us through how that works.
In North Suburban area I work, when you're patrol, it's much easier. It's, you know, there's no calls holding, and they're lower level. High property crimes. If you're familiar with the transit system in Chicago, the L system came through there, and the metro train. So a lot of commuter traffic, but a lot of people coming. We had homeless problems back then, and things like that as well in those areas. But for the most part, the work in patrol was pretty easy. But you could hustle because you had a lot of proactive time, and that's how I made a lot of arrests and got some notoriety for doing that. But when I was able to work some of the task force and actually some of the cases, I was in Cabrini Green, which was one of the worst. It was so bad is that you had to have officers stationed outside your parked cars, and you had to have officers, and you could not go in elevators because they threw everything at you in there. So you had to walk up sometimes 20 flights of stairs, and you had to have backup, in the building with you. You had to have 4 officers just to take a routine call. So I've been in that situation, and then working some of the surveillance teams with property crimes. I would go from the Wisconsin border to the Indiana border. We do surveillance. I did a lot with similar to what our OCD, their organized crime thing with shoplifters, because the networks of people that would travel the freeways from suburb to suburb, stopping and ripping people off. And back then it was when they used to fence the stuff. Now it's, all kinds of other scams that they do with property and sell it at flea markets and things like that. But it was a pretty organized, system. And so there were things I saw. I mean, I was in a lot of critical incidents, and that fortunately, I had a very close call on a rooftop with an offender that pulled a .45 on me, and we were in a stalemate on a high roof, where not much place to hide and seek cover, and I ended up getting an award for that and caught that. He was one of these serial nighttime burglars breaking in through skylights, and I heard the noise, and like a young fool I was, I climbed up the fire escape and was in a standoff, and was in another incident that I recalled where a rookie officer, we actually thought he was shot. There were 8 shots fired when he tried to apprehend an escapee, and the offender came over the roof, and myself and my partner were able to catch him, but we came real close to shooting him because we thought he still had the officer's gun, and turns out he dropped it. But after hearing 8 shots, you think the worst, and the call goes out, officer down, officer shot. My finger couldn't have gone another fraction of an inch or whatever, and it would have been, the shooting there. But those were other incidences, chases. It was more wide open, car chases that went for 30 miles and at high speeds, and we took more risk back then. There was none of this, a lot of times you didn't wait for SWAT. You kicked the door down and went in. So I think it was good that we got away from that, although my first year here was a little bit open here. I mean, we were a little bit more open than we are now, but for better reasons, where it's a safer way. You don't rush in like that anymore. But yeah, we took some risk, and there were some, those old crap moments that you think about later, and then you have the war stories and laugh about it, but it's not very laughable when you're in the midst of it and you're, sweating bullets.
Chief, let's talk a little bit about when they announced your retirement. When they had that press conference where the mayor was there and yourself.
Yes.
And we all saw the press conference. But, basically what we got out of that was that you were retiring for family, personal reasons. But later on we find out that it wasn't your choice to retire. Basically, you were asked, and you don't have a choice but to retire. Can you expand a little bit on that? How that went about, or how that happened?
Right. So it was the weekend before Labor Day, and it was a Friday, and I had heard there was a lot of rumors going on. I mean, it's the current interim chief was famous for rumors, and there was a lot of stuff being said. Even the union president had told one of the lieutenants, hey, about 6 weeks before this actually happened, if you want anything from Geier, you better get it now because he's not going to be around. And for the past year or even more, there was a lot of the rumors of my retirement. I had to send out a citywide email again last December, refuting that. But it seemed like everything revolved around Medina wanting my job. And so during that summer, especially right around after some of the protests, it seemed like it kind of was more intense. Again, the rumors, people were asking me, when are you leaving? Why are you leaving? And it wasn't true. So I kind of dismissed it, which I probably should have listened a little bit more because I would have saw it coming. I wouldn't have got blindsided. So the last 2-3 weeks before that Labor Day, Harold Medina would come to my office and say, hey, I hear they're going to fire you, make me interim, and go do a national search. And after about the third or fourth time, I go, where are you getting this? And he wouldn't say. And then sure enough, Labor Day, here's what happens. The Friday before, I had issues with Harold, and I was going to move him from field services. And we had just done a reorganization of duties for they had made these Deputy Chief 1 and 2, like they're not assistant chiefs, but they were the next in line. And Medina was Deputy Chief 1. And I told Sarita and Nair that, hey, I'm going to move Medina. And she kind of got upset and said, well, you can't do that without the mayor. They're the mayor's appointees. You can't do that without his permission. And I said, well, what about this rhetoric? Well, who's running the department? Because there have been a couple editorials. That would have been the big thing is, why isn't the chief stepping up? Why isn't the chief? What does the chief who makes the calls? And she just backed down. She didn't say anything. So Sunday, the day before Labor Day, and again, this is a 3-day weekend, so you're supposed to enjoy that and have time with family and whatnot. His scheduler calls my assistant and says, hey, the mayor wants to meet on Labor Day at a Starbucks near your house. And I'm going, well, we had meetings like this before. There was many times where he did that, and it was nothing where I saw it coming. I probably should have, but I didn't, because he came in there and it was kind of casual. We actually ended up meeting in a park by my house, which was, kind of a weird setting. But he started with, hey, have you thought about retirement? When are you going to retire? And I said, well, I'm not quite ready. There's a few more things I want to do in my career here, and we're just getting started. We had issues with violent crime and some issues with, again, Medina not following some of the plan to do that. And when the mayor said, well, he goes, it's got to be sooner than that. He goes, this violent crime, that's on you. And I said, well, some of it is, I guess, as the chief, I'll take accountability. But I said, but you didn't sign these grants, and Medina didn't follow the violent crime plan. I said, so we all should share some of that. He goes, no. He goes, it really falls on you, and we got to move forward. And then he mentioned the CASA stuff, is that, it seems like you're not cooperating with CASA, which was not true. I mean, we had put up a lot over the years, and we actually started a whole bureau just to address CASA. And up to that point, we had done everything they asked and then some. And I think I mentioned in an op-ed recently that what Dr. Ginger and company would do is keep moving the goalposts past. As soon as we got close, there were some new rules, more things to add, and stricter. And then if we did fall back, we lost ground in some of those, and we had to start all over. So it was you would think at this time, it was after we're still COVID, we had just had all these protests, we had the high crime, and then we had CASA. It was an unprecedented time to be a chief.
I want to back up just a little bit and expand on the whole deputy chief chief rank. Obviously, the chief of police is the boss.
Right.
Deputy chiefs are second in command, and each one of them is in control of a certain part of the department. Under your control, obviously. But when you were hired as chief, at the time, it was kind of common knowledge that the mayor had selected Medina and Banez as deputy chiefs, but it's also been reported that you picked them. So maybe we can kind of clarify that.
Yeah, it's well, the way it went was.
And the reason I say that is because you even kind of mentioned it, that Sarita had said they were mayoral appointees.
Yes,
so.
and he, we met with the mayor I met with the mayor, and obviously he was going to make decisions of who to keep in the department as deputy chiefs. There were a couple incumbents, so to speak, in Eric Garcia, who was really deeply embedded in the CASA and was doing well. So if he decided to stay, we wanted to keep him. Art Gonzalez was another one that, was kind of neutral during the whole Eden campaign, and neither here nor there. It wasn't a problem, and he was doing a good job. We needed somebody with some so we could transition smoothly from what we were inheriting was, kind of unfathomable to us in some cases. We didn't understand what had occurred, so we decided that he would stay. And then he gave me a choice, and I really needed somebody that had proven be a crime fighter, and Medina was a very good friend of mine, and he had done a good job that way. I guess I didn't know him well enough to see a side of him where he would become greedy for power. He was my choice. Banez was the mayor's choice, and I think that was because he had worked the Southwest Area Command, and the mayor had talked to some of the counselors, I think, at the time, Ken Sanchez and Pena, that, again, a commander in the area command is like the nexus to the command area. They do everything for their city councilors, and they work closely. So I think Banez, got some kudos from them, and so the mayor went with him. And so that's how the 4 deputy chiefs that stayed, were allowed to do that, or the 2 deputy chiefs that stayed, and then Medina and then Banez were the new choices. But yes, you're absolutely right. I brought Harold here.
Chief, when you were asked to retire, the mayor said that you were pretty much, your staff was going to be gone also along with you. He mentioned something about your staff was also automatically out.
That came afterwards. Yeah.
Coming afterwards.
Yeah.
So who are the staff that was asked to leave?
Well, I mean, number one, my executive assistant, Paulette, she just got a letter that position, her position, was at the pleasure of the chief, and since I wasn't here anymore, she no longer had a job, which, considering she was just the victim of a HR type incident where John Ross, the whole case with that, and so she got moved initially and then lost the job when Medina came in. They've moved a lot of different positions. As far as the staff, it really was just her. I mean, there was no one else that basically, nobody else.
What happened with John Ross?
Well, I mean, he was like Medina. They both got greedy. Medina for position.
Was he asked to leave?
Well, good question. Okay, now you're hitting some good points. John Ross, the incident that happened when Paulette first reported to me, it didn't seem as bad because they had been having some feuds. They were actually really good friends, but John was very self-motivated. He made sure he got the best vehicle. The computer incident was another example, but he had tried other things to try to get a $900 vest for off duty. I mean, he had the position that he could do procurement, worked with budget and things like that. So Paulette caught him, trying to, get that. They wrote a memo, used my stamp, and so he confronted her, and there was an incident. At first, when she didn't report it right away, it weighed heavy on her, and she finally came and said she wanted to make an IA, report it as an IA case. So I wrote it up as an IA case. They didn't move John Ross. That would have been, since it also involved, she also opened an HR case at the same time. So they didn't move Ross. Instead, at some point, they moved her, and they moved her to animal control. And it just so happens she didn't even realize how bad it was, but she has a minor cat allergy. They put her in the room next to the cattery where, although you can't see them, but when the air conditioning came on, she had such a bad reaction that they call an ambulance, and they told her not to drive because her throat was closing up. So it was interesting because the remark made by one of the mayor's staff was, well, if she knew about that, she should have said something. Well, she didn't know that there was going to be 300 cats in her room next door.
And they also didn't give her options, I'm sure.
No, and just the optics of that. So John Ross then, the IA case was opened on him. And I'm glad you brought that up, is because it took a long time, and John Ross was close friends with Zach Cottrell, who's the commander of IA. And before that, they went to lunch together. Even during the investigation, they were seen meeting. John Ross had got Zach Cottrell, who's inside position, a brand new truck. Okay, he got Jack Cottrell's girlfriend a parking space on the ramp. There was a lot of this back and forth, taking care of one another. So John Ross's case went through. He was put on leave then. Eventually, I was able to get him put on, admin leave. He worked at home, and again, this was post the raise that he gave himself. So he was making full pay, deputy chief's pay to sit at home. And eventually, the case after it wasn't really resolved until after I left. As a matter of fact, that same day that I talked to Sarita about moving Ross, Cottrell gave a briefing to both Sarita and myself about the Ross case and minimized and said, well, we found out that he had permission to buy the computer. And I said, from who? And they go, well, from IT. I said, well, he doesn't work for IT. And I explained the whole thing about the memo that was false and the stamping. And it apparently made no difference because I heard that they minimized all. They didn't sustain some of the more higher violations. And originally the recommendation, I believe, was termination, but Medina, and this, I may not be accurate on this because the rumors I'm hearing too, but that I know for a fact that they let him retire. So he didn't resign in lieu thereof. He was able to retire.
Chief, when you said they will not move him, isn't that your decision to move him, or who's they?
Well, it was the administration because the case went to HR, and in every other case, as it is if there's conflict between two people, one has to be moved. But if somebody's a victim, why you're going to victimize them twice by moving them? And so he would have been the Sarita and Nair, I believe, was the one in HR that decided to move Paulette.
I guess we got to clarify the history of you and Ross and Paulette, the admin assistant, right?
Right. She was an executive. She was the chief secretary.
She was your basically, she did all your work, and so you brought her from Rio Rancho. Is that correct?
Yes.
And Ross.
Yes.
So they worked for you in Rio Rancho, and they were the ones that actually you brought with you.
Yes.
Because you do have that option as chief to bring people.
Well, with Paulette, I brought her because that was the job she had for me before, and she's like my right arm. She just was on top of things and very good. She has like 30 years in working government jobs, a lot of experience, and just very good to have around. Ross was I promoted him to captain there, and short time I didn't really know him. People portray themselves differently in the first couple of years of the job, but they were looking. New York PD had come out, and they did like not an audit, but evaluation of our department to give us some ideas. And they said that there's too much for the chief to do.
And we're talking about Rio Rancho, right?
No, we're talking back in Albuquerque now. After Ross Ross didn't get hired yet, but New York made that evaluation and said you need like a chief of staff position, somebody that can, if necessary, be your driver, go to events with you and hustle you out, but then do whatever other assignments that, paperwork that, signing different documents and, things that aren't really important information. I mean, in terms of where, they can sign with signature authority for me. So that's the position we created. And if it was a lower level position, it was supposed to be below a commander initially, I believe. But Ross got it. And he actually, to his credit, he did well. It was an admin job and he did well. But the more he learned about our department, the more he was able to, use that for his gain as well. They both were there. They were best friends. I mean, when they came, everybody was happy that it was like a reunion for those two. And there was no issues. But eventually, with some of the other civilian staff on the floor and, and what Ross and Medina both did is there were two admins up front, and you worked in the department. Those were basically, the admin people that were the receptionists and answering the phones. They become almost personal secretaries, one for Medina and one for Ross. And that's not what it was about. And that caused the conflict with Paulette because none of them were supervisors, but you put, it's like high school again. It was that conflicts that went on. And I don't have time for that. And the people on the floor didn't deal with it, properly. And it caused those conflicts and those issues.
So basically you had your executive assistant and the two deputy chiefs wanted their own executive assistants. So they kind of recruited
and to the
girls
point
that were supposed to be working up front.
Yeah. And to the point where the girls were doing things that were out of their job description. I mean, in one case, one of them was, they don't usually get laptops and phones, but she had a laptop and she used John Ross's code to do timesheets, which is against our policy for all the other deputy chiefs and stuff. And so, it got where it was, kind of a power situation, and that's what led to all the conflict on the 5th floor.
But as of today, Ross has retired.
He's retired,
and Paulette obviously was let go.
They did not find another job for her. They said is that there's no other position, although they could have found a comparable position.
What happened to Commander Byrd from the academy? Did she get asked to resign too? Or?
No, she didn't. But it's an interest. That's a story in itself too. Is there was some issues at the academy, and we had at least complaints of the way the basic staff, and this is a different academy from our day when we started, and it's not so much they're kinder and gentler, but they have to be more careful under CASA in terms of the academic portion, and as opposed to the first day when it's like beat them to the ground and see who quits. It's more a team building approach. So which is good. It does help develop some officers. The culture of the officers don't go out thinking everybody's against them. They work with each other. So there were some issues, and we had 2 deputy chiefs that were in charge of the academy during her time. She came. We could not have found a better person. She worked the Satellite Academy as a director down in Hobbs. She knew New Mexico training. She had been an instructor and the supervisor at Academy where she was a police officer as a sheriff's deputy outside in Wichita, Kansas area. PhD candidate. I mean, she had all the academic background. She knew training. She had I want to say up to 8 or 9 master certificates and, everything from firearms to, DTs. So we had her, and so she was doing great. We got 56 paragraphs of training in the CASA. We were in compliance with all those. These guys were kind of out of control. No deputy chief took issues or did with it. She didn't want to be that person that, because being relatively new, just a couple of years on, but I saw it. And so I said, well, then I'm going to take care of I'm going to look over the academy for a couple months and see what's going on. And in less than 3 months, there was at least one exit interview where they claimed disparate treatment of women. The next month, there was a tort claim filed for racist remarks and treatment of a 40-year-old Chinese female. So we have the trifecta there: age, sex, gender, and sex, and all this stuff. And so that was filed, and then a couple more cases with women and all kinds of issues at the academy, about 7 or 8 issues. And so I was ready. I had it all documented. I still do, to bring it as an IA, where I was only able to bring a little bit of that to IA, and they opened an HR case because at the same time, those people knew that we were changing the job description from basic instructor to a general instructor. So because we had to spread them out over 4 components of the academy: RBT, Reality-Based Training Center, the range, advanced, and basic. And so basic staff was kind of isolated and just did their job, and there were a lot of complaints on them. And they turned it on her, and Sarita and HR or city legal. Again, we talk about moving people when there's that kind of conflict. They moved her, and I moved 2 of them out based on the severity of what they were accused of, and then they started an investigation. So from she was moved, she was allowed to work from home. Just recently, she's able to come back on Mondays because she was not to have contact with the one cadet class, or this group. But since they were off on Monday, she was able to come back and do her job. But there were threats that, yes, she was feared she was going to be fired. She just had a disciplinary hearing and on an issue that involved all of them, and she, being the commander, caught the most serious of the discipline. I think she's appealing that, but hopefully she'll come back. I don't know if the outcome of that HR case, from what I understand, they didn't. Normally they would do that like with Rick Foley's group or the RCI, the other private investigators they didn't want former law enforcement looking into cases, so they hired an attorney to do the investigation. The last I heard, she interviewed 37 witnesses, and I don't know how much that cost the city, but that started in May, and here we are mid-October, and it's still not done.
What is her status? Is she still employed?
She's still employed. She's working. She works Mondays at the office, and she does the rest of her work from telecommuting.
So a couple things. I mean, maybe some clarification. This is the second time you mentioned an HR investigation and then an IA investigation. IA, obviously, internal investigations is the common one that everyone knows. What is a HR investigation? I guess I've never heard of that one.
Well, and to be honest with you, neither did I. But now in the short time before I left, I think we had 3 of them where if there's city policy violations, such as the under EEOC, if somebody's treated wrongly or unfairly, or there's tension between 2 people, and there's maybe harassment within the workplace, they open up their own investigation. And it's more common in the civilian side of other directors, do that on their own, and it goes through that route. But we were one of the few that had their own internal affairs type. And we have 2 because we have a component just for force as well. But now I've seen cases go to both IA and HR, and it's almost like a double jeopardy. Yeah. And it's the HR, when I got as a witness in the case, you get the same form letter, and it tells you that it doesn't identify you as a target or a witness. And the last line is this, this could result in up to termination. And I would ask, so as a witness, I could be terminated? It's very unclear the way they did it, and I think it was kind of goofy.
Do they do Garrity during the HR?
Well, that's interesting because I don't know. They do it in the RCI when we hire a contract investigator. They have to do Garrity. But in HR, it's a different, for officers, I don't think, officers have that right not to, speak then if it's going to be used, again, obviously, if it's criminal, then they don't answer. So we're going to, fire them for not answering the questions truthfully. But, I don't know how those rights apply.
Yeah, it's an interesting, I've never heard of that, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
So it must be kind of new, and it sounds like it's kind of politically connected even. They can make that investigation turn out however they want, one way or the other.
Are they investigating SOP violations?
Well, what happens is this is what's happening with the case with Byrd and these other people at the academy, is it's coming back, and then it'll go back to IA to look at SOP for that, and that's when I'm sure IA will have to reinvestigate it and probably do Garrity now that you mention it. Okay. But so their initial findings, and I've sat on civilian, the reviews following an investigation by the contract investigators, and basically they're looking at the internal policies of the city, rules and regs, and the merit ordinance, different things that apply to civilian rights within the city.
So Commander Byrd, she came from, was it Bosque Farms her last?
Her last job after she left the Satellite Academy was she was a captain there, and she was being groomed because the former chief was retiring, and so she made captain, and she became chief.
So who was Commander Byrd a appointee of the mayor, or did you bring her on?
Well, here's how that went. So we went to New Orleans for it was actually to do the EPIC training and see how that program worked there, so we could bring that back, which we did. But we met a lot of their officials because they were under a consent decree a lot longer than us, and they had a lot more serious problems. And their academy director explained how it worked, and they actually had, and she spoke as well, they had the old school commander, and then they had a civilian who was I think she was like a deputy dean or whatever they call it, associate dean at a local college. And so she went in the first day and did, here's the thing with law enforcement is we put people as the head of the academy that know nothing about training, and we set them to fail because they're learning as they go, and they're responsible with CASA for some very serious paragraphs, and also all the training of all the officers, and from MOE, which is the in-service training, to basic, and then all these required training for the use of force. So we were going to do the same thing. We were going to come back and do a national search. So she was part of the New Mexico Chiefs Association, and so one day during one of the meetings that we had, I was talking to somebody else about that, and they go, well, you got somebody in the room here that was a satellite director down in Hobbs. And I said, no, I didn't. So somebody introduced me to her, and I started talking, and at first, I brought it back, and then I go, we need to recruit her. So I went down and talked to her, and she probably wishes she stayed there. She loved what she was doing. She was a chief. It was a small town. She actually got overtime, and she was just, for her, it was a lot of fun. She was back on the street, but she also liked training, and so she took the offer. And so I actually ran it by Sarita and the mayor, and they also interviewed her. But yeah, we were fortunate to find somebody in New Mexico. to try to recruit somebody of that caliber, I never would have thought we would have found somebody. So I recruited her, and the mayor approved it.
Chief, can we go back to Medina?
Yes.
So you mentioned earlier that you had issues with him, and at one point you even said that he bordered on insubordination.
Yes.
Can you give us some specifics as to exactly what led for you to want to transfer him, and what issues did you have in mind when you were talking about that?
Yeah. So what happened was obviously last year was a record year for homicides and shootings, and we were just getting our act together in terms of identifying what we needed to do as a priority goal. And so we made and I kind of directed our staff, we worked on it as well. We isolated it to, we wanted to reduce gun violence, okay? Because most of the homicides a lot of them were firearms, and our shootings were out of control. I mean, people, besides just the stop signs with holes in them, people were getting shot at in drive-bys and road rage incidents, accidental shootings, anything you can imagine. There were just a ton of guns on the streets. So we said reduce gun violence, and we picked a time frame because it's a to-from type thing. As we just throwing that out there doesn't mean anything. We want to have a time frame to measure. Were we successful? And it was going to be from January till the end of this year, 2020. The two components were the performance measures were going to be shootings with injuries, okay, and homicides with firearms. So we had two metrics that we took 2018 data and drew a baseline from month to month. And what we did then is we took the goal and we drew another color line on this graph month to month, and then started 2020. So we had a company come in from Franklin Covey, a leadership company. They wrote a book called 4 Disciplines of Execution, and I had read the book, and it's just a system where you set a goal, you determine the activities. In our case, is TAC plans and POP projects and other measures too, because it was going to involve the whole department. So Crime Stoppers and criminalistics with processing crime, especially the NIBIN systems with firearms casings. Even investigations too, is working those cases to identify those offenders, warrants on people that are drivers of crime. That was the goal, is to get the whole department not to operate separately and independently, and to reduce it by 15%. Well, at the same time, Medina was doing a program called Duke City Stats, which is like a CompStat, and it's a good program, but he did it to the exclusion of that program. And now when they came out, we broke our contract with them because we were the first police department. They had done hospitals and Fortune 500 companies and big business and some government entities, but they hadn't done police, so they couldn't quite translate their program. And it's just 4 steps. It's you set the goals, you set the activities, you keep score, because you don't want to wait to the bottom of the ninth with 2 outs to say, hey, we're losing the game and our numbers are bad. And then you just hold accountability measures. It's basically is turn in your stats and then, show how you've adjusted it. You just don't do the same thing over and over. That's the definition of insanity. And you get it to the lowest level. It's not just my order. It's sergeants or commanders talk to lieutenants talk to the sergeants talk to the officers. They know where these people work. They know from the calls where the problems are, and you engage them. It's hard to resist if you're part of the solution to say, oh, I don't like that program, when you get to pick where you want to do it and what and work harder. So Medina didn't pay attention. In the first 6 weeks, the field services fell 6 weeks behind. We could not get the first 6 weeks of data because they didn't do it. And his excuse was, well, they don't understand. So we set up a remedial training. And if he's not engaged, what he does is he's on his phone a lot. He's in and out. He's very distracting during training. I don't know why he would do that during something that was so important. But again, so we went 6 more. We had the 6 weeks. We went to a point where then I was watching the meetings, and I could see that they weren't doing everything that I had asked. That was part of the layout. I had done, as a matter of fact, a 2-hour training that I put together based on the Covey, but I did it in police lingo and the application to our department with examples, and it was like a 49-page or 49-slide training. So they knew, and they had all the documents. They knew what they were supposed to do. They weren't doing the what they call the WIG sessions, which are basically just the meetings, with short meetings once a week with your officers. And CompStat had got their two city stats that got so blown out of proportion it became like a color commentary. It was basically it's supposed to be your commanders and the lieutenants, the people that are operational. We had 50 people on a Zoom call. Harold's tight with the AG's office, the DA's office, people that weren't civilians. They didn't need to be on that, and it's hard to hold people accountable when you have that much of a broad perspective. And so I called them out on it that you're not even showing the graphs, okay? Because what I saw in the graphs that were being produced, we were losing the game. Rather than being below the line, we were above the line, and it kept going up. So I called them out and sent out a special order. Not about football jerseys, by the way, but it was about.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Yeah, it was about basically that this is what you're required to do, and we outlined in the special order. It was 2020. I remember the number, and said this is what we expect of you. That was May, and so I did an audit in the beginning of August. And guess what? None of his area commanders did it, and I don't blame them. I think it falls on his direction. I called him out on it. I told him we're changing, that he's not going to be doing Duke City Stats. We're changing the format. We did change the format. We did the first meeting on September 2nd. Lasted much less time than theirs were going, sometimes 2.5 hours. And it did exactly what I wanted, is to coordinate people to work together. If an area command is shorthanded and they're having problems, share your resources. You've got investigative people that are there to help, because the scoreboard's not just where the city stats, okay, in terms of that 15%, is each area command had individuals. So in the field, you could see if they did it right, they would have been able to come in and say, holy crap, crime's way up. What can we do about it? And take some pride in it. And that was part of that engagement. They weren't sending those out. So nobody knew. It was like you're just working with no goal in mind. And, and pickup basketball is like that. You just play and there's no score, you're not going to play so hard. But if you're playing for score, what happens? Everybody's pushing a little harder and it becomes competitive. It wasn't to be competitive, but it was to get that kind of drive. And he failed. I mean, in my opinion, between that and not getting the grants, that's why violent crime just kept going up. There's no reason that we couldn't have made a difference. And some of the joint efforts with the feds as well that were here, despite the fact that it was unofficial because we weren't on the funding of the Operation Relentless Pursuit or Legend grants money yet, but they were here. They were here to help, and we weren't using them effectively. But it wasn't until after that first meeting when we had done a pilot with the feds and we kicked butt in the Southeast that Medina started doing like warrant roundups and bringing. So he's doing a lot of those, and I think they've done 5, and they're producing all the stats. But why couldn't you have done that back in January? Okay.
Do you think he was doing it to make you look bad?
Well, that I can't answer that. That's in his head, but it definitely wasn't to help me, and it wasn't really to help the department. I think that he had his mission and his goal, and he just did it his way. And I don't know if he just didn't like it or didn't understand it, or like I said, it seemed that it might have been a better program than his, so it became that kind of competitive. Because he had been, the rumors were is that he was going to be the next chief, and I was going to be leaving. He made that real clear across the board. People would tell me that during exit interviews to watch my back. But I think, it could have been something that would have been more to my discredit, than to our credit as a department.
Do you know anything about Chief Medina's wife trying to get on the department a few times, and something keeps happening to that process? Can you speak to that at all?
Well, I know in the past, several years ago, she was in at least 2 cadet classes, and I think the first one, was a little rougher back then, and I think they were hard on women, but something about she didn't pass on the run, and then I think it came back to her credit, and failed, I think, on a shoot on the second. So she did try a couple times, and then for a long time was not interested. What I heard recently was, Harold's good friends with the Attorney General, and she's working for the Attorney General. I don't know if he got her the job or whatever. As part of her training, she went through the CNM training, which is like the state. It's a 16-week basic. It's not APD's academy. We use it as a stepping stone because we have a whole second phase to that when they come to us to be APD. But we are looking at laterals outside that have no experience. Some states let you pay for your own academy, and some agencies will sponsor you, but if not, you're like freelance, but you bring that to the table as a bargaining tool as I'm certified. So they were looking at what they called lateral with no experience. So she was in the C&M class, and I guess in the last week she failed to run. And the way the state standards are, you have to take the whole class over. And Medina, I heard he gave some, tried to manipulate things and I still don't know what the status of it is. But the assumption and the rumor that's going around is that he was going to get her to be a lateral get right from that to a lateral without experience.
The only reason I bring that up is because it kind of speaks to the type of character that he is. If he's having the issues with you, that he would also use his position to kind of get his wife in a position that maybe she doesn't deserve. But I don't know, and I think there's questions about it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have all the answers on that, and I don't want to speculate and do say something that would harm her or whatever, because that's not my intent here.
Chief, go back to Medina. So he was on record saying that you weren't handling discipline properly, and he brought up the incident with the in custody death.
Yes.
And he was critical that you did not terminate the officer for that. So can you expand a little more?
Yeah. Why don't you walk us through how that all went down? Because obviously he went through the IA process, and then it went to your desk.
Right. And let me backstep it a little bit. I just got some of this data today. The number of IA cases that have increased, and I can provide you guys I'll send that to you, have like threefold. And the number of people fired is, like we've had 5 times the amount of people fired.
Is that since he's been interim?
No. This is since the CASA. I mean, since we've been dealing with CASA. So as far as not doing discipline, all those come eventually through me, especially the terminations and things. So I mean, it wasn't that I was ignoring discipline, because we had more discipline, and that's my problem, is we're over disciplining the officers to the point where it goes on their card without them even having a hearing. You were in the union before. I mean, we know that you have to have a PDH or be able to represent. I mean, talk about constitutional policing, that's due process, right? So They were just doing this, and officers were, I think sometimes that could affect their performances. Nobody's going to want to do their job if every time you turn around you got an IA case. So I was reluctant that we were getting to the extreme with some of this. Franco's case was this. IMR 3 was probably 2015. We're up to IMR 12. Those are the reports by Dr. Ginger and the team. Franco was that was one of the first years the CASA was here. They came in 2014. I don't think the officers took it that seriously. They had a bait card, and they had a chase with an individual, Majestic Howard, well-known criminal. He had actually been shot, had part of his skull removed, shot by a homeowner during a home invasion, 30-some arrests, and he's in his early 30s. So not that makes any difference, but they were dealing with a hardcore criminal, and Franco took him down too hard. I'm not sure I didn't see the video, if it was a knee to the head or something that definitely he got in trouble for. And he caught a major suspension at the time, but he became the poster child for the CASA, that was an incident that
they used him as the example of what not to do.
Yeah, and this was back in 2015, so I wasn't even here then. And he did his time. He got, kind of a horror story, because he lost his car, and he was, named in that, kind of, that's not a notoriety that you want. But for 5 years, he didn't get in any trouble. I think I saw a couple other minor things and some camera violations, things like that. But he didn't get in any more trouble, especially no more use of force. And so, lo and behold, and it's like a perfect storm. And even he takes accountability, but it's not intentional by any means. He's working foothills. He had in kind of one of those I'll use the word dirt magnets, but he caught a lot of bad guys, okay? And he got a lot of people in stolen cars. So one night he makes the graveyard, he makes a stop, stolen car, 2 people in the car. One had warrants, so he wasn't going to charge that person, and another person was the one that was in the car, so receiving and transferring. Franco's got him. The Foothills has holding cells. What they don't have is a camera system to the officer's room. It only goes to the commander's room and impact. So if you're in the room, if you saw someone laying on the ground or doing something, you would check him. He's required every 30 minutes. He didn't make those checks. He doesn't refute that at all. He recognizes it. Not that somebody couldn't commit suicide as soon as you walked out the door, but there was nothing this guy gave intention. There was no CIT hits or warnings that this guy was depressed and had issues in his life, 50-some years old, mental health issues and whatnot. But Franco was wrong. I mean, he should have made those checks, and he didn't. And so also, as luck would have it, there's a pair of shackles that had been left in there. We found out they had broke and they never took them out. And this poor guy managed to use that to hang himself. Franco comes in, finds him. He walks out of the room, calls for help, and the lieutenant came in and they kind of took it over. There were questions about whether he should have done first aid or anything, but Franco said he looked at him and the cuffs were embedded in his neck and he wasn't breathing.
Beyond help.
Yeah, he said, I've seen dead bodies, and that was a dead body. And he didn't want to, he perceived it as a crime scene, and the last thing he needed was more grief on top of what he was already going through. So the case went to IA. He was on admin leave for, I want to say, 3 months. And I'm going to talk about an incident that happened in that because I think this is part of what's going on with this culture. So Franco's on admin leave. He's at home, middle of the night, hears somebody fooling around with his truck, goes out there. His property, he's got his gun, confronts the guy. The guy pulls the gun and points it at Franco. Franco doesn't do anything. He could have been killed there, and his answer to me when I asked him why, he said, I was so afraid of being in trouble that I would be disciplined or be fired that I didn't want to shoot. And he could have been killed with his wife and kids in the house, and that's what really. So I knew that. I looked at Franco's case. Everything he did, I sustained. Okay, there were some violations that he did. He actually. He wrote the report, why the person was there, and he, in his last line, in the heat of the battle, he didn't check it before all this went in, and neither did the sergeant. It said that the subject was, taken to MDC and booked.
With that incident.
Yes, and so, but that wasn't like he wrote that to cover up anything.
Right.
It's just he wrote it and then never came back to it. So that was in there as well, but that was a lower level violation. But the serious ones were not checking, so I looked at it, and if you remember the chart of sanctions, it goes up to the sanction 1, and sanction 1 at at one level is either suspension or termination, and a serious suspension would have fallen into that category. What we did then is, it used to be, and still to some extent is, where it would go through the commander, it would go to the deputy chief, and then the chief would have the last word. That was always policy, and it was the CBA at the time as well. And the chief would only make that decision after a PDH, whereas before the PDH, the commander and deputy chief weighed in. So we started to make save time as IA did a presentation to everybody at once, the PowerPoint, rather than just reading it and how it is, rubber stamp. Well, the commander said that, so I'm going to say it, and the chief said the same thing. And we'd have a brief discussion, and preliminary we'd sign as a group what we would suggest. But this is just from before the PDH. It's just from the IA's recommendation standpoint. And what I would do then is I had 10 days. And I would look at it, and I would watch the videos again, and I'll make a point about that in a second. I would, in some cases, I would talk to his supervisors that worked around him, other officers. I'd find out his work history. I'd find out, obviously, look at his performance, his card. Did he have other discipline for aggravations or progressive discipline? But in Franco's case, he really didn't have a lot. He actually was Officer of the Month during that period and had some good compliments. So, you weigh it out. It's a judgment call, but I wasn't going to fire him. I thought, he had 13 years on this in the middle of COVID. I know that that's compassionate and maybe that should have no bearing, but, it should, as I have to look out for the officer's back, is because that would have had an impact on anybody else that worked around him. So I decided, and I basically gave him the most suspension I've ever given anybody. 360 hours is 3 months of not pay. They made a big thing about, he got the ability to work it 1 day a week. Well, that's what we do, is you can take it to vacation times. We all know that that's in policy. Nobody's going to make somebody take the whole lump and not have money to support their family. They can work it off as long as it takes. And so he had that as part of the option. In addition to the suspension, I moved him from his assignment. He was working for a newer lieutenant, so we figured put him with somebody stronger. And I don't call it a PIP because it's not a performance improvement. I'm sure never again will I ever not check a cell block.
PIP, for those that don't understand, performance improvement plan. Yes.
So I just wanted to manage performance management. I call it, because again, he was never going to do that incident. I mean, how are you going to prove that's a it's not a pattern of something that he was doing? So I had him with a really good lieutenant and weekly reports, and I was getting good reports from his lieutenant and his commander for a period of time. And I also said, and he was very brave to do this, but I had him talk to a cadet class, and basically he gave a career survival as this is what happens when you screw up. And in his case, is he had to tell his neighbors that his car was in the garage, and he had, why it wasn't there, and he had to get a second mortgage on his house. There were a lot of, and he was getting married, so there were a lot of stress that, in addition to the punishment that he was going through, and he spoke frankly about his incidents and how he made mistakes, and openly gave them the information and I just reinforced it with, if you do your job right, and sometimes we're going to make mistakes to the head, and you'll be backed up if you're with integrity. You're not a crooked cop, or you're doing something a criminal or things like that. But don't be afraid to do your job if you do it right. And again, the message Franco gave is, you don't want to be somebody in a jumpsuit when you're your family's hero. That's not the way you want to. This job means more to him. And so I thought he did really well. Well, the monitors went crazy on that. And Dr. Ginger specifically, I was blindsided on one call where I had asked for some advice from one of the DOJ people, and you have to get special permission to do it. But, I mean, he heard my side, and he didn't really say I should terminate him. He said that he liked the idea of, some of the stuff that I was going. It's not like hardcore criminals going to prison where we're going to rehab them or whatever. This is mostly behavior modification. And I was convinced that he would get through this and actually it would be a good example for others. And they didn't like that. Ginger's comment was, I'm not going to have another Franco death on my watch, his watch, although we almost had an officer death on his watch. And it was just things where the point is when Ginger writes his IMR report, they didn't want to see something like that in it because it's negative comments. So city attorneys came to me when normally this would be a site visit, but it was Zoom. They were afraid Ginger was going to confront me about this. And they said, Chief, you got to watch the video. It was 12 minutes before somebody came back in that room. Franco didn't notify anybody for 12 minutes. And obviously, after a PDH, I just kind of relayed to you guys. I watched that video several times. I'd stop it. It wasn't 12 minutes. And he also said that that Franco's last case wasn't 5 years ago. It was 3 years ago. And I said, no. So they insisted. They could watch the video, check it. Well, I did. And I checked it with DC Grego, and we did the timeline. 12 minutes was 14 seconds. And it was 5 years. So they were just so hell-bent on having me change and I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't compromise my principles. Ginger didn't even bring it up until later when he started talking about discipline, and they started pulling all my cases. And I actually had an officer, lateral officer, okay, Southeast has a carjacking, 2 armed offenders. 15, 20 minutes later, Northeast has a chase with that car, and they lose it. So this poor guy is working Valley, and way at the north end, he's handling a call on Alameda. We've worked downtown. Most of the people are going to be down toward the center of the area command. And he sees a car go by with no lights, or a truck with no lights. And lo and behold, it's the ATL. And he recognizes it as such. So he's by himself, so he just doesn't put his lights on. The car's maybe going 10 miles over the limit. He just stays with it. They don't run. They don't try to take evasive action. Obviously not violating our policy at that point. He's not violating our policy. But he's calling ahead, and he gets a spike belt, and I think he went through a red light. They made it. He didn't, and he admits that he went through a red light without. But this is 2nd Street at 3 a.m. It's not uncommon that you would do that. Spike belted. The chase is on. Car wipes out some distance away. They do a felony stop. And our felony stops now. We know that you're going to raise your gun and point it. Okay, and it's nothing wrong with that, but you have to report it as a show of force. But nobody would try to hide that deliberately because you do it all the time. But the officers didn't report it, and the sergeant missed it too, probably because adrenaline's up. It was a great arrest. I saw that case, and I saw that because it came to me because it was 40 hours of suspension for the chase and that together, I was furious. I go, here's probably one of the best arrests that I've seen in a while, and this guy did everything right. He was patient and calm and held it together, and yes, he admitted that he forgot to write it in his report. So I think I wrote some verbal reprimand or something for that. But no way am I going to give an officer 40 hours for something that really I should. So here's what I did. So I exonerated him on the chase. I exonerated him. I mean, basically there was nothing else that was going to give him any suspension. I immediately wrote a commendation, framed it, and the next day went to the area command that he worked in front of 2 squads, and I said, do your job right, and you know what? And we recognize you for doing it right. If you make mistakes, you learn from your mistakes and move on. But don't ever be afraid to do your job, because who's going to want to do a traffic stop on anything? And especially this poor kid. Next time he saw a wanted car, he's going to go, I should put the blinders on because I'm not going to get in trouble or lose my job just trying to catch a criminal.
That's a fantastic leadership story right there.
Yep.
That's impressive.
But that's one of the ones Ginger pulled, and I'm sure that he'll mention. I haven't seen IMR 12, but there was a couple others examples where, you know what, not all those kids, we were so hell-bent on, from supervisors up, and I don't blame them because their butts are on the line too, that everybody was to go into the maximum discipline or disciplining, where in years past, some of that could have been taken at a lower level, but we weren't given that option anymore. And so, yes, so with that case is, then what ended up to put closure on that is right before the deadline for Ginger's report, I got a call or an email from a city attorney saying, you have to move him. And I said, why? Take him out of the field. I said, why? He said, because we don't want to see another unnecessary use of force. And I said, he hasn't had one in 5 years. And I got accused of, well, you're going to, the officer's going to be mad at you if we don't get through CASA. And I said, I don't think they're going to be mad at me. Well, they made me move him. Well, he understood his job was, he didn't want to fight anymore. So he said, Chief, where do you, I told him, I said, I can put you on an inside investigations. And he said, no, put me at the airport. He says, I just don't want to fight him. And it was going to be 90 days. He decided he wants to stay there the rest of his career because he's so afraid of losing his job. And this is a good cop that could be helping us reduce. So I had to do that as well. So Medina, what happened is because we did that, I thought that is double, basically 2 punishments. Is I told him that if he was in good standing, because he served like 150 hours without complaint and was doing the job and he was willing to get moved permanently, I put it in abeyance the rest of his suspension. And that's what Medina's going at, is that he's saying that he should do the whole suspension. Medina's saying is he's going to try to say that he can, I think he said something about overriding my decision and that he would have terminated him. Mm-hmm. Again, going back to that meeting where all us were in the room, that was it. That was the recommendation. But I never went against the group and they said, oh, Chief, you should terminate him. They were still those next 2 stages, the PDH and my 10-day investigation. And so the final call is by the chief. They actually took that authority away from me, and we gave it to 2. Medina had it 1 month and Grego the next, because of the fact they were worried about CASA. But if you look at a best practice, and even I just saw the mayor gave us a booklet on the mayor's conference on reform, and it says the chief should have the last say in it, because the chief has that 10,000-foot perspective that looks at the whole organization rather than sacrifice collateral damages, get rid of Franco, and then we'll appease Ginger. And I just refuse to do that.
It's a leadership move.